Hello, welcome to my first devlog for Tower of the Tyrant. But what is Tower of the Tyrant? Tower of the Tyrant is an experimental and development dice battler like Library of Ruina with combined aspects from other games. This is also my first real game I've tried to make, so I've had a lot to learn. It also means that in the process of learning, there was a lot of things that I did right and wrong, which I'll be going over in the video. I've worked on this project for a little over 2 years now, and there are different iterations of the game that I developed that I'll be going over in this video. I'll also be going over my methodology for game design, art, and UI. But before I could start working on the game, I needed a game engine to design the game on. In this case, I chose Godot. Now, the reason why I picked Godot consists of a few reasons. The reasons being, it's not hardware heavy, it's free and accessible, and it's easy to pick up. After this, I would start to develop the game. Now, the type of game I would make would be an auto battler, where the flow of combat is determined by dice. This animation would be a vague idea of what I thought the game should be like at the time. The first version would be a simple auto battler, where the player and the enemy would automatically fight back and forth. The sprites were created in GIMP, where I would lean more into a pixel art aesthetic. It would also be my first time animating characters, if that wasn't already obvious. The code consists of moving the characters back and forth in a simple way. Whoever wins pushes back the enemy, and once enough time passes, they will dash back at each other to clash again. After I had the basic combat style down, I would add a health bar and a label that shows the dice roll at the current moment. At this point, I would also start to tweak the combat a little. As development continued, I started to think more about how to make the game enjoyable. This is where I started to add on more mechanics to the game. In the next version, I would clean up my code by creating classes for dice. This would make it much easier to create new cards and effects. I had also developed a new game mechanic which allows you to switch cards. In the future, I would build around this for more engaging gameplay. After this point, I thought that the mechanics were sufficient enough for me to start developing assets, and this would lead to a huge jump in progress. I would start to create backgrounds and enemies that fit in the backgrounds. I would also invest more time into practicing art. This leads to the first floor that I developed, which is the demo for Tower of the Tyrant. This demo includes the first floor, which is presented like a Slay the Spire map, which I learned how to make from a YouTube video. I'll be using gameplay in the background to show the mechanics I've developed and maybe go into some explanation about certain aspects. In this version, it is a Pathfinder roguelike where you can fight up to 9 different variations of common enemies with 3 variations for each area. There are also 3 different areas that can be distinguished by looking at the environment and the enemies around it. Each enemy variation has a different deck with different abilities. Cards now have special properties akin to how Slay the Spire card effects work. You can tell if a card has an effect and what it does by clicking the Effects tab. Some of these effects can be as simple as getting higher rolls to something more in depth, such as conditionals that may unlock special attacks. So each character has 3 dice or 3 attacks, but certain cards have their own special attacks built in that you can see when a clash is won. It was made this way to show how over time the person you play as learns and gains more experience. Enemy cards also have special effects, and they can also have different abilities. But with 10 enemies, each one has a different build to fight against. Another mechanic I'd like to focus on is stat points. Stat points allow for someone to strengthen the max or minimum roll of the dice, so that they are more powerful and roll higher. I thought this would be a fun thing to build cards around by making conditionals for cards like roll max, and you achieve that by using stat points. With stat points, I also added retractable stat points, which allow for someone to lower the roll of a dice in exchange for stat points. The only issue I found with stat points was the monotonous aspect to allocating stat points. The shop area here is similar to Slay the Spire. It is different cards along with relics that change how you play, and relics are passive abilities that give benefits depending on the conditions met. The rest area is also similar to Slay the Spire. The only difference would be the addition of choosing buffs. Every restroom has a buff you can pick, and some buffs can synergize with the cards you can get. I would also work on different builds you can choose as you pick cards. The 3 basic builds I would create would be Strength, Haste, and Wound. Strength is focused on pushing rolls up and overpowering the enemy with sudden bursts of strength. Haste is focused on accumulating as much speed for powerful cards to debuff the enemy. Finally, wound is focused on stacking the debuff wound on the enemy to deliver a swift blow that deals more damage based on the wound stacked on the enemy. Now, there are other builds, but they're not as fleshed out as these three. Finally, there is the boss. In my opinion, the boss, the Conqueror, is the magnum opus of this project. But what's special about the Conqueror? The Conqueror is an enemy that changes over the course of the battle. Not in a complex way, but in a simpler way. He gets stronger as more turns pass. This means you are incentivized to use most of your mechanics in order to stay ahead of him, as it's very easy to get behind. He has attacks that can increase his strength, and he can punch down and throw you around to make you weaker. If he becomes too strong, you can face him in a showdown, where winning the showdown deals damage and lowers his rolls. He can also absorb your strength and haste to use as his own. And that would be it for floor 1. Now at this point I wasn't really sure what to do. I developed assets for floor 2, and I had progress. But I knew that this was something that cannot be released due to a lack of professionalism. So I decided to remake the game from scratch, but in HTML. I had a few reasons for this, but the most important ones were to use as a chance to see if I could innovate on the main mechanics using a blank slate. At the time, I had played a few RPG games, and I wanted to see if I could alter the game to make it more RPG-like. I still had an issue, which was that my art was simply not as good as I wanted it to be. So I finally decided to use an app that was dedicated to pixel art, Sprite. Now, Sprite was a good boost in about every way. I liked working with GIMP, but I would say that Sprite aligns with what I want more due to its focus on pixel art. The app also negated the anti-aliasing that would occur when I would move around a selected area. I also, during this process, learned more about color palettes. See, before I would loosely pick colors without much thought put into specific values for hue, saturation, and value. But that all changed when I discovered the website LowSpec, which contained a palette list along with art made using that palette list. When I saw the art that was made using the palettes, I realized how important picking the right colors was. And it would make me realize the critical error of my previous art, which was that a lack of a specialized color palette is what created the inconsistency in my art. From that point on, I made more of an effort to study colors and the best combinations. Now, I knew a little about colors and color theory, but using a color palette helped me understand certain aspects of color, especially value. I would use this site to recolor the main character using Oil 6 palette from the website. After the character was created, I would start to create the same amount of attacks as I did in Godot. During this process, I found myself doing much better than before. I even figured out how to make the sword spin by using a Bayer matrix to imitate the spinning of the sword. I also changed my animation philosophy a little bit. I would put more emphasis into the wind up and wind down of the attacks for a more complete movement. I would also change the attack stop by using one frame for the sword swing arc, but this time, after the sword swing arc was done, I would have the character fall through a little bit. After this, I would create a background, but instead of just using whatever colors came to mind, I constructed a color palette. Now, I didn't do this out of thin air. I used colors from one of Bob Ross's artworks, and I tweaked the colors to suit me best. After that, I would implement some of the new tools and techniques I learned, one of which was a gradient Bayer matrix. This would replicate the blending of colors and save a lot of time instead of doing it manually. I also gave up using anti-aliasing. Instead, I would blend the surrounding colors for a more natural design. I would use these new techniques to make my first and only area. Now, I will clarify at this time, I'm not making this as large scale as I did in Godot. I'm just attempting to polish the art, gameplay, and code to make it look more polished like a finished game would. I also wanted to learn HTML too, by making a game in HTML. After I finished the background, I started to design the game logic. After I got the clash system down, I would work on special abilities. I created a new command category called stances. Here I would create a new stance called defensive stance. This stance would block by subtracting the amount of damage inflicted by the amount the character rolls. If you know you might not win, you can use this stance as damage control. After this, I would create a new command category that has a set of skills that can change how you play. The first one would be prepare, which has a condition that requires the character to deal 0 damage that turn. If they complete this condition, all dice the player has are re-rolled one extra time in the favor of the player. So each dice is rolled 2 times and the higher roll is picked. This would give more incentive to use defensive stance in order to prepare to deal big damage next turn. The next skill would be Focused Aggression, which creates an extra dice by using the combined average of the maximum and minimum rolling dice. The final skill is Overpower, which is a conditional that triggers if you have max rolls that are greater than the enemy's. If the conditional activates, the roll would be increased by 50%. I would then create the Cards category, which would allow you to switch cards. After that, I would make the Items as the final category. The Items tab starts empty in this demo, but depending on how you play, it may not stay that way. After this, I would start moving on to creating the enemies. The first enemy is more of an experiment. As much as I like the new palette, I had to get used to it. There isn't really much else to say about him. The second enemy, however, is one that I poured a lot more time into, not only in terms of mechanics, but also in art quality. I found myself struggling with the color palette a little bit, so I would finish the design by slightly tweaking the colors in my color palette and creating different shades. I started to create more complex mechanics. Not only would I have conditionals, I would also have my first scripted event. In this event, the enemy would throw the axe. If the enemy's stance is normal, he will dash forward, but he will be impaled by the axe. However, if the player uses defensive form, a QuickTime event will occur, which will allow for the player to counterattack by stealing the axe and retaliating with it. Completing this event will give you not only an item, but a new form. Axe form is a new form that uses the axe to skip the first dice of each clash and deal damage. The only issue is that the damage is decreased. The second ability gained is the use of the item axe, which allows you to chuck the axe at the enemy, dealing damage based on a percentage of their maximum health. And after this would finally be the boss fight. And not only would there be a boss fight, there would also be a cutscene. The Conqueror here is done in the Oil 6 palette, and his attacks have been slightly changed to be more akin to a martial arts style. He also has the Showdown attack, which has the player dice start at 0 and the incentive to climb up to beat the high rolling dice. Depending on the roll, either the player will win and strike the Conqueror, or the Conqueror will win and punch the player back. Admittedly, this fight is a lot less complex than the Godot version, but my goal in the HTML version was to polish the art, code, UI, and gameplay. After defeating the Conqueror, there is also another cutscene. I decided to switch to more animated cutscenes to better represent who these characters are. Since it was an animation, I would create more complex expressions, which better express what a character is feeling. I wanted to make cutscenes for a while, and I thought that now would be a good time to try. Up to this point would be the amount of progress that I made. So what happens now? If you are wondering what I will do next, I'm planning on recreating the game in Godot. Now I'm going to take mechanics from both games and combine them. For the game mechanics, I'm also thinking of a few new things. A new mechanic I would like to add is skill trees. I think this would benefit using different builds and give more profit to certain playstyles. I'm also planning on scrapping the Slate Aspire type map and implementing an overworld instead for each tower floor. I think this would work better and it would allow me to improve on the world building for each of the floors. I'm also going to try to work more on sound design. Now I did get into sound design a little bit, I just didn't know where to look for sounds or how to make them. I'm sure that throughout the video you may be able to see that I am not very experienced with game development, which is why I would appreciate any critiques you may have. If you like any mechanics that are used throughout the version, I would appreciate it if you let me know. If you have any ideas that might help the game that I didn't think of, I would also appreciate those too. This is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it.